It was one quiet morning, one famous outlaw, one young man with a gun, and a decision that would echo across the American West for years. On April 3rd of 1882, inside a modest home in St. Joseph, Missouri, the most hunted man in America was finishing his breakfast. Jesse Woodson James sat at the table with two young men he believed were loyal allies. The room held the ordinary sounds of a family home. Chairs scraped against the floor, a newspaper rustled as Jesse read the latest headlines. Outside, horses moved through the streets and shopkeepers began opening their doors. Nothing about that morning suggested that one of the most famous outlaws in stories in American history was about to end inside of that living room. Jesse James had spent years building a reputation that made him both feared and strangely admired. Born in Missouri in 1847, he grew up in a region filled with strong Confederate sympathies during the Civil War. As a teenager, he joined guerrilla fighters known as bushwhackers. These fighters carried out brutal raids across Missouri and Kansas, attacking Union soldiers and civilians alike. Jesse rode with notorious leaders such as William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. The violence of those years shaped the young man who would later become the most famous outlaw in the country. When the war ended, many guerrilla fighters struggled to return to normal life. Jesse James was one of them. He, of course, chose a different path. Along with his brother Frank and a group of outlaws that became known as the Jesse Younger Gang, he began robbing banks, stagecoaches, and later trains across the Midwest. The robberies were daring and often violent, but they captured the imagination of newspapers across the country. Some stories described him as a ruthless criminal. Others painted him as a rebel who challenged powerful railroads and banks. Whether hero or villain, Jesse James became a national legend. For about a decade, the gang managed to stay ahead of the law. Then in 1876, everything changed. During a bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, local citizens fought back. Several gang members were captured or killed. The gang scattered, and the James Younger Gang never truly recovered from that disaster. Jesse continued his outlaw life, but the circle of trusted companions around him grew smaller every year. By the early 1880s, Jesse was living quietly in St. Joseph under the alias of Thomas Howard. He had a wife, children, and a house that looked perfectly normal and perfectly ordinary from the outside. Yet even while trying to live quietly, Jesse still dreamed of rebuilding his gang and returning to robbery and crime. And that's where the Ford brothers entered the story. Robert Ford had been born in 1861 in Missouri and grew up hearing the stories of Jesse James. Like many young men in the region, he admired this outlaw's reputation. Meeting Jesse James in person felt like meeting a living legend. They say never meet your heroes. By the time Robert was barely 20 years old, he and his brother Charlie were spending time with Jesse and eventually living in Jesse's home. For Robert Ford, it must have felt like stepping into a story he'd heard about his entire life. It was like living with a star before movie stars even existed. But admiration has a way of turning into ambition. Authorities across Missouri were desperate to stop and end Jesse James. Governor Thomas Crittenden had made capturing the outlaw one of his top priorities. Railroad companies and express companies had offered large rewards connected to the capture or death of Jesse and Frank James. The bounty tied to Jesse James eventually reached $10,000. That was an enormous fortune in that time. In early 1882, Robert Ford made a secret decision. He surrendered himself to authorities and entered into a quiet agreement with the governor. If he killed Jesse James, he would receive a pardon and the reward money. And he already had the perfect opportunity. He was living inside of Jesse James's home. For weeks, Robert Ford waited for the right moment. He spun his wheels. He bided his time. Then came the morning of April 3rd of 1882. After breakfast, Jesse picked up the morning newspaper, and the article he read that was One of his former gang members had confessed to a murder connected to the gang. The news made Jesse uneasy. It raised questions about loyalty and secrecy. He began to wonder why the Ford brothers had never mentioned the confession to him. This was somebody the Ford brothers had also known. Suspicion briefly crossed his mind, but still the room remained calm. Jesse stood up from the table and walked across the living room. He placed his revolvers on a sofa nearby. It was a casual gesture that suggested he felt safe in the company of the men around him. This was a mistake. Then he noticed a framed picture hanging above the mantel that had gathered some dust. He stepped onto a chair to clean it, and in that moment, his back was turned. Robert Ford drew his revolver. One shot cracked through the room. The bullet struck Jesse James in the back of the head. The outlaw, who had survived years of robberies, gunfights, and manhunts, collapsed instantly onto the floor of his own living room. The most famous outlaw in American West was dead. Robert Ford and his brother immediately contacted the authorities to claim their reward. They surrendered themselves, believing they would be celebrated as heroes. Instead, something unexpected happened. They were charged with murder. Within a single day, the Ford brothers were indicted, pled guilty, and were sentenced to death by hanging. But only 2 hours later, Governor Crittenden issued a full pardon. Legally, Robert Ford had done exactly what the authorities had wanted him to do. Public opinion told a very different story. Many believed that Jesse James deserved to be stopped, but they despised the way that Robert Ford had done it. Shooting a man in the back while he was standing on a chair didn't look like bravery. Newspapers across the country labeled Ford a coward and a traitor. Today, we would have called him a snitch. Ironically, Ford tried to turn that notoriety into fame. He began performing in stage shows that reenacted the killing of Jesse James. Audiences watched as the famous moment played out again and again. Posters advertised him as the man who shot Jesse James. But notoriety is not the same thing as respect. For the rest of his life, Ford carried the reputation of the man who betrayed Jesse James. In 1884, his brother Charlie died by suicide after suffering from illness and addiction. Robert drifted through several towns in the West, opening saloons and gambling houses. Eventually, he settled in Creede, Colorado, where he opened a dance hall and saloon called Ford's Exchange. Then on June 8th of 1892, another quiet moment turned violent. A man named Edward Capehart O'Kelly walked into Ford's establishment carrying a double-barreled shotgun. Witnesses said Robert Ford's back was turned when the man entered. O'Kelly only spoke a few words. "Hello, Bob." Ford turned around to see who had called his name. The shotgun fired, and Robert Ford died instantly. Newspapers quickly gave O'Kelly a grim nickname. He became known as the man who killed Jesse James. And with that, the strange chain of violence surrounding Jesse James claimed yet another life. The American West produced many legends, but few stories twist together quite like this one. A famous outlaw betrayed by an admirer, and the betrayer haunted by his reputation, and a final gunshot that closed the grim circle. Sometimes history writes its own endings with remarkable symmetry. But now I want to hear from you. Do you think that Robert Ford was a coward who betrayed Jesse James, or was he simply a young man who took the chance to stop a dangerous outlaw and claim a reward? Tell me what you think in the comments. I really do want to hear your take on this one. You can go either way. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss another incredible moment from our crazy history.